Hi, my name is Christy Kahl, Editorial Director of Cure Magazine, and in this week's Speaking Out video series, we have Lisa Schlager from Force, who will be discussing over-the-counter genetic testing. So to start, what are genetic tests and how can they benefit somebody who thinks that maybe they are at risk for cancer?
Great question. So when most people think of a genetic test for cancer, they're actually thinking of a test that looks at whether they have a hereditary predisposition to cancer, or if somebody's already been diagnosed, whether or not that predisposition might run in their family and maybe they've inherited it. There are different ways to do that type of test these days. You can do it with a cheek swab with some tests. Others have a spit kit, like you spit into a test tube, and then the traditional method is through a blood draw that you can have done at the doctor's office.
Okay. More specifically, what is a direct-to-consumer test?
So people might not think of it as direct-to-consumer, but what we consider direct-to-consumer or over-the-counter is a test like a 23andMe test, where you can buy it at the grocery store, at the drugstore, and a lot of times it provides recreational information about your ancestry, but it can also provide some information about potential genetic risks or hereditary risks for healthcare conditions. In particular, it could be cancer, it could be diabetes, heart disease. There are different tests out there that have different components to them that cover those areas.
Okay, great. And why do you think these tests have increased in popularity over the years?
I think there is an entertainment factor to it. It's really interesting, especially as America becomes more of a melting pot, to see where we came from. But I also think that with the growth in medicine and genetics, the manufacturers of these over-the-counter tests are finding ways to incorporate testing for things that people find interesting or informative, such as risk for certain diseases. The issue we have here is that those types of tests aren't really medical grade tests. And so we have to keep that in context when somebody's deciding to use one of these over-the-counter tests to look at their potential for risk of disease.
Right.
Yeah.
So what are the major differences between over-the-counter and if you were to see a genetic counselor who recommends that you get this testing done?
It's like night and day. So as an example, as I shared, 23andMe has a component where you can opt to test for, quote, the BRCA mutations. Although it only looks for 3 of potentially thousands of BRCA mutations. So we have the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene mutations that have been associated with increased risk of breast, ovarian, prostate, and pancreatic cancer. And some people are interested to know if they in fact may have one of these mutations. But when you're only testing for 3 of potentially 5,000 mutations, and those 3 mutations are the ones most commonly found in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, you're gonna miss a lot of information. And looking at the fact that the Ashkenazi Jewish population is only a little over 2% of the US, that means 98% of the population is unlikely to have those specific mutations. And they're missing out on that information. Whereas if you were to go to a genetic counselor or a healthcare specialist with expertise in genetics, they would talk to you about your family history, determine which testing is most appropriate, and they would probably give you a test that's much more expansive. And we have to understand also that the BRCA mutations are not the only mutations that cause increased risk of cancer. We now have dozens of mutations with names like PALB2, CHEK2, ATM, Lynch syndrome. These are all mutations that cause increased risk. And if you were to test for only the 3 BRCA mutations, you're really not getting good information about your potential risk.
Right. So it's missing all of that, but in a way, because it's increased in popularity, are there any pros to maybe the benefit of growing awareness around genetic testing?
So it's definitely raised awareness among the population. I think there have been a combination of factors that have done that, dating back to Angelina Jolie in 2013 and the Supreme Court case around patenting DNA in the BRCA genes. And then, of course, these newer over-the-counter tests. And we're glad that it's raising awareness because that's a positive thing. And in some cases, people do find out that they have a mutation, and that's incredibly informative information. But on the flip side, it is not something that people should make medical decisions with. They need to confirm that information by seeing a medical expert, and ultimately they have to keep it in context for what it is, which is more, again, entertainment, recreational for the most part.
Right. And there's been critiques that some of these tests may not be reputable. So how can consumers do their research to make sure that they're getting a reputable test that's actually telling them what they are at risk for?
Great question, actually. There's been a lot of reports of fraud in the media recently. People selling tests to unwitting consumers who don't realize who they're dealing with. They don't realize that they're being duped out of their insurance information or their Medicare information. And I think the important thing is if you go see a qualified healthcare professional, they're more likely to be able to steer you to a reputable test. If you're going to do a test over the counter, look at it for what it is. It's kind of a fun thing, and it may provide you with some interesting information. But in fact, the best place to learn about health risk and health conditions is through a qualified healthcare professional or a genetics counselor. Ultimately, if you do test positive for one of these mutations through one of these over-the-counter tests, you need to confirm it with a healthcare provider anyway. The other thing I think to be aware of is if something seems suspicious, go with your gut. Don't play into the hands of people who are not being on the up and up.
Right. Are there certain characteristics of these like fraudulent tests that maybe consumers can be more aware of?
Absolutely. Making promises about coverage and that everyone is able to get it covered now and 100% free and no cost to you, or if they're aggressively marketing. We've seen people marketing these tests at health fairs and senior centers, and that's not a reputable way to do this. That's not how healthcare is supposed to be done. So we advise people always seek out a trusted healthcare provider if you want to pursue genetic testing or explore whether it's right for you.
Definitely. So some of these tests are FDA approved. Can you maybe explain what this means?
Yes, so FDA approval basically means that the FDA has vetted it and determined that the test is in fact accurate for what it claims to do. The reality is the vast majority of genetic tests are not FDA approved. They are CLIA approved, which is a designation under the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. And so really it comes down to knowing who is providing the test to you and making sure that the company, the name of the test provider, the laboratory, is in fact a reputable lab. And there are ways that consumers can look that up. But again, the best way to know that you're dealing with a reputable lab is to go through a trusted healthcare provider.
Right. So I think you kind of went over this a little bit, but if somebody does receive information that says they could be at risk, what are your recommended next steps so that they're taking the right steps in the right direction?
So we do see people who do a test and it comes back and tells them that they have potentially a mutation that puts them at increased risk for cancer or another disease. The next steps, and I will outline that most of these tests do say this in their literature, but we know all of us kind of glance through those booklets or all the disclosures. But the next step is to take that test with you to a trusted provider, whether it be your internal medicine doctor, your OBGYN, your oncologist, or a genetic counselor, and say, this is what I found out. Can you help me understand what this means and help me verify that this information is in fact correct? What we are seeing some people do, which is very concerning, is they take what's called the raw data from some of these tests and run them through third-party databases and software platforms that basically spit out additional information that was never really intended to be communicated, and they read too much into it. And we just want to caution people about that. It's very dangerous, it's very misleading, and in fact, you really want that kind of information, the best thing to do, again, is to talk to a genetics expert.
Absolutely. So one way I like to wrap these things up is to ask, what would you say is your biggest piece of advice for someone who thinks they're at risk or does have a family history with cancer?
I think the first step would be to talk to a doctor that you have a relationship with, share with them your concerns. Most doctors will either have a mechanism for assessing your risk in the office, or they'll refer you. Ultimately, there is coverage for genetic testing for people who have a family history or certain personal cancer histories. And so that the cost is either nothing or very little out of pocket. So people don't need to turn to these less reliable tests in order to get the testing. In fact, they would be better off spending the small amount or going through their healthcare provider and getting a more accurate and comprehensive test.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.